Good morning, across the street and around the world. Welcome to Missions Monday. We're talking today about an unusual subject in the sense of a lot of people don't really think a lot about it, but it's a big part of missions internationally, and that's literature. It's not the first thing you think about, but it's one of those details that always seems to crop up when you're involved in missions. We are in a digital world, but much of the world is third. In fact, about almost 6 billion people live in third world situations. And literature is still a major methodology for communication of the gospel and reaching people, and also promotion of events and things that involve the ministry. So it's great to talk about that. In studio, we have with us Pastor Steve Angelonis, who's very much in charge and involved in our literature program here in Baltimore. And on Zoom, we also have Pastor Jason Moore to join us as well. So we're going to talk about it. Pastor Angelonis, start us with a devotional.
All right, so we're talking about, really like how do we communicate? This is a process of communication. This may sound a little bit like a church history lesson a little bit, but when we think about the way church history progressed in the towards the end of the beginning of the 1400s, end of the 1300s, into the 1400s, and then with the Reformation movement, Martin Luther, John Calvin, Samuel Zwingli, Erasmus, all these people that we look at, we have to go to an important point in world history, which is the movable type press, which was Gutenberg. You may have learned this in your class in the 1400s. Movable type press, the Western civilization did not invent the printing press. That was invented in China, but movable type meant that you would create a set of letters out of cast iron or cast metal, and then you would organize letters and be able to print a page. And what it basically did, it created a way for books to be mass produced. And so now Paul's letters and the letters that were produced during the early church period that were circulated, we know that literature played a major part in establishing the foundation of doctrinal understanding, preserving the apostolic traditions and the apostolic stories. So when we look at our New Testaments, we're looking at something important in terms of world literature, maybe the most important pieces of world literature. And as far as we are concerned, especially as Christian believers, the literature that was produced during those days, it was very costly. I mean, how did this happen? Okay, let's go back into Roman history. How did the philosophers produce their documents? Well, basically, they would sit in a room and they would talk, and there would be copyists around them. So they would copy down what was said. Those things would be copied by other copiers, and then they would be circulated. Paul wrote letters, many letters. We have 13 of them, or 12 or 13, depending on whether you think Hebrews is written by Paul or not. The stylistic way, if you analyze the style of Hebrews, it seems to be, different from the other letters that Paul wrote, but maybe he wrote it more academically. But he certainly would understand all of the points that he's making in Hebrews, and perhaps all of that information came from someone like Paul, who was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. But communicating in a way of writing is a remarkable thing throughout the scriptures, because we know that Moses got the tablets from Mount Sinai, brought them down. We know that the Hebrew letters are interactive. If you've ever read a book on Hebrew language, you know those 22 letters, they interact in some way, and letters make other letters inform other letters. It's a worthy study to look at the Hebrew letters and the way they interact, and why this language is maybe the basis of our faith, because the scriptures came, the oracles of God came, and they were delivered in a written form. When the people of Israel went through the Jordan River into the promised land, there were two mountains there, Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. And they were told to plaster those mountains and then write the law of God on those mountains for everyone to read. The original literature, maybe. So these things were all written down, written for preservation. Why do we know so much about these stories? The oral stories were committed to script in some way. Hence, we have the word scripture. And then Nehemiah, we know when Nehemiah came back to Jerusalem, you read Nehemiah, we know from some of the apocryphal writings that are not considered inspired writings by the Hebrew rabbis, but they are considered useful. We know that Nehemiah collected a library. How did we get the collection of the Psalms, the collection of the Proverbs, the collection of the books of Moses? These were all collected by the people who returned to Jerusalem after the captivity. And maybe during the captivity, there was a lot of copying going on. The literature was being preserved, so it's necessary. So I think if we go back to the early church, how did literature become so important to the early church? It's that the oral tradition, certainly this was the way of sharing things. This was the way of communicating in that time frame. So we don't want to minimize. There have been some books written during the past couple of decades, sort of minimizing the memory system of people who spoke to each other in the oral tradition. And this is and all of this is really devilish because it's calling into question the memories of these people who saw Jesus alive after the resurrection. And when they started talking about these things and sharing these things, and so we know in the book of Acts, James, the brother of John the apostle, is beheaded. He's executed, or maybe I think he's probably beheaded. He was executed with the sword by Herod. And this delighted people. So then they throw Peter into jail, and they're all contemplating how they're going to murder Peter. And this is going to be a big thing in Jerusalem. But as these people their lives are being threatened, this became a more conscious understanding. We have to record the things that we've known and seen for the future generations. So we start to get the gospel records. We have 4 of them: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Most scholars, I would say 65 to 75%, consider Mark one of the original documents, followed by Matthew. And then Luke came along, and Luke seems to have collected as much information as he could from all of the people that he talked to, and he recorded it and put it down in the book of Luke, the gospel, and then the book of Acts. So literature became sort of a foundational element in the early church. And then we have the epistles, of course, the epistles of Paul, the epistle of James, the epistles of Peter, the John epistles, Jude's epistle. All of these are pieces of writing. The Hebrews epistle, pieces of writing that went out and circulated among the church. Did everyone have a copy of these to put into their whatever, what do you call it, into their toga or whatever?
Tunic.
Slide up their tunic, slide up your sleeve, those kind of things. So we know that copies of the scriptures were circulating, especially from the book of Acts, when we see that Philip, the deacon, goes to the Gaza area, still an area, still a region. He goes to the Gaza Road and he finds the Ethiopian eunuch reading a copy of Isaiah, gets a message from the Holy Spirit: go attach yourself to that chariot. That guy needs someone to ride shotgun with him and tell him what he's reading from Isaiah 53 about the shepherd and the lamb who was slain. And who's he talking about? So when we talk about literature and the faith of the Son of God that we have, it's these things that were written down for our understanding and for our sharing. It's important to understand. And we know that over the course of the years, over the course of the centuries, there has been a great effort to discredit the gospel records in particular. But we have fragments. We have fragments that date back to the earliest to the first and second century, a fragment of John that was found. And then the most important thing to understand about the scriptures, if you've, there was a dump, yes, a dump that was in, I think it was outside what's now Cairo, but maybe Alexandria. But there was a dump there that was where they found like a bunch of scattering little pieces of literature. And these were like very common Greek pieces of writing, Koine Greek, as they call it, the language of the street. And when they found these grocery lists and little notes to people, even, romantic little pieces of literature that were tossed away, this opened up the understanding of how people communicated. And we understand that the epistles that Paul wrote were communicated in the language of the market and the language of the street. And so language so people could read these things, Galatians, Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, these pieces of literature were written so that when they were read out loud, they were read in the language of the people so they could understand. So this was for preservation and for propagation. Literature has always been for preserving our understanding of the oral traditions, putting them down on paper so that they can be verified and checked and reconciled with each other. Because it says that the Bereans, they were more spiritual than these people in other cities because they listened to what Paul was telling them, then they searched the scriptures to see if what Paul was saying was correct. And so when we started to get the written word into our hands, this was the momentous change. The Gutenberg press made it possible for people to have copies of the scripture. William Tyndale, John Wycliffe, John Huss to a lesser extent, Martin Luther, and others, they started producing the Bible in the language of the people so they could read it. And then if someone came along preaching, you could open the book and say, wait a minute, that doesn't line up. And as people began to have the Bible in their hands and it became portable, and they could open a Bible in front of them and check the scriptures and edify themselves and be led by the Spirit and the understanding on the pages, then their lives were transformed. And this led to the transformation, not just of the church, but civilization in the West as we know it. So all of these things, people thinking, people talking, people communicating, literature, very important. Now let's take you into the Bible just for a brief moment. When we think of Deuteronomy 17, there's an interesting passage here. And this is the forecast from Moses about how a king shall be. Now remember, Israel doesn't have a king yet, but Moses is given this. You shall in any wise set a king over you, verse 15 of Deuteronomy 17. And that king, this is the way the king should be. He should not multiply wives. Interesting. He should not multiply horses. He should not multiply silver and gold. Well, if you look at Solomon's life, you see that Solomon violated all these principles. He might have been better off if he had done this. Verse 18, it shall be when the king sits upon the throne of his kingdom, he shall write him a copy of this law in a book, and out of that which is before the priests of the Levites, and it shall be with him, and he shall read therein all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord God and to keep all the words of this law and these statutes and to do them. There is maybe the most important thing for any kind of civic leader to do, is to have a copy of the scriptures, copy it himself. I take this to mean that the Bible was to be written down by the king himself. He was supposed to take that piece of writing and keep it with him so that it could be a ready reference for him. So here from the beginning, we see that the literature, the scripture, those things written down have a great value in communicating something to our hearts and being a ready reference to us when we need counsel and direction and leading. So this is why literature on the mission field has become such a valuable thing. Wycliffe, Tyndale, Luther, all the way into George Mueller, also Hudson Taylor. Literature played a huge role. Amy Carmichael, literature played a huge role in sharing the faith and propagating it and preserving it. Amen.
Awesome. I like that history lesson on literature. And more importantly, I like the two words you mentioned about preservation and propagation. And when you speak about missions, you're really talking about propagation, the propagation of the gospel. And I feel as like a lot of times in missions, our propagation, we're trying to be so technical, up to date, so to speak. But the world is uneven in its modernization. What the ways that the gospel might be communicated in one area, it may be communicated differently somewhere else. Mm-hmm. And as I alluded to earlier, 2/3 of the world is third. So most of missions that occurs, the majority, the lion's share, is in the third world. And in the third world, governments and civic organizations still use literature to communicate. Mm-hmm. Even here in America, literature is a big part of our communication. There are millions of dollars spent on paper communication in this country. A lot of it is Christian communication. I remember there were tracts that were made by an organization called Peter and John, and they still make them, and they still send them. So I want to just touch base with both of you guys about the propagation, literature in terms of propagation in missions. Pastor Jason, I know in your experience in Europe, you guys had tracts. Did you guys do what I did? We kind of made our own tracts. Because there's two ways to go about it. You get somebody else's track. This is back, now we're talking about 90s, early 90s, late 80s. You get a stamp. You get someone else's track. You stamp your name and your address on that piece of paper. Only problem we found is that the organization that made the track had their information on it. The distributor of the track had their information on it. And then you had your information on it. So it was a bunch of names, a bunch of addresses on the back of a track. So we started making our own. Did you guys make your own track?
Yeah, good morning, Pastor Ronaldo, Pastor Steve. Good to be with you. Yes, definitely. We made our own tracks, and we, just had different people on the team that could write something that would sound relevant, and definitely had our own personal nuance, and had them translated obviously into the Ukrainian language. And yep, for sure. Mm-hmm. I love Pastor Steve's devotional this morning.
Mm. Would you say that, Pastor Jason, talk me through making your own track? As funny as that sounds, there's no Bible college class for that. Most guys walk in, they like to use our tracks sometimes. They walk into a situation, they'll use Greater Grace Baltimore's tracks. A lot of times we travel, we'll use the Baltimore tracks because of the contact information. But walk me through living in a country and making your own track.
Yeah, I think some principles about writing that I have learned, and Pastor Steve's been very helpful in the books that I've written, editing and giving great input. And some things I've learned is that what you write will go beyond where you go geographically. So something that you've written may far outstretch and go beyond any geographical area that you might even reach. It might span the world. I remember being in the Eastern Ukraine and finding a Just Let God Love You booklet by Pastor Stevens in a kiosk, and it was in an eastern city of Lugansk, which is about 36 hours from where we were living. We were doing mission work. Wow. And that was crazy. So Pastor Stevens' Just Let God Love You booklet in English was in this obscure kiosk in the deep Ukraine. Wow. I think what you write will outlast you. When usually people are famous after they're dead and gone, unfortunately, but your work will keep speaking beyond you. And then people you'll never meet, you'll reach people that you'll never meet. So I think with tracks, you write to make it readable, like the reader is able to understand what you're writing. There's relevancy to what you're saying. Mm-hmm. I love the old English, and I love the old writers because their work is timeless. Just have to get past some of the the verbiage, but it's still very deep. Are there deep books today? Very few. The Christian literature today is very kind of emotional and surface, but the writing of the past has been so deep. And then also I think making it duplicatable. So with a track, your message should be simple. It should be something that people can understand what you're saying without a lot of terminology, and relevant in the sense of what's the mood of the culture, in this sense where the Bible touches every aspect of society. So when we were writing our tracks in the Ukraine, we focused a lot on the word grace, because of the communist mindset and the atheistic mindset as well. So we'd address not only the systems of grace, but also different things that would address the intellectual mind. Is there a God? Or what is man? We used Pastor Schaller's message, "What is man?" That message that he spoke years ago. We actually created a whole track on that. What is man, from Psalm 8. So it kind of what is the mood of the what? I'm sorry, am I still there?
No, you're right here.
Yeah, what is the mood of the society that you're addressing? Is it an intellectual? Is it a college? Is there a lot of fear? Is there a lot of doubt? Kind of maybe addressing different topics like that.
Okay. Give me some. Let's be a little bit more practical. We're talking about tracks here. I've come to learn a little bit about color. That color matters. White paper never works. It's interesting, over the years, we've been making tracks now about 20 years. White never works. Red doesn't work. Light green, yellow, and light blue, particularly light blue. Those three pastel colors seem to work best. Anything larger than that, you tend to look like you're advertising something else, like a disco. Also, the picking up the font, being able to read it. Just colors matter. Also size. For instance, sometimes we have books that open up, like a leaflet opens. Most folks don't want to go through the process of opening your book on the street, but a single page that I can see the front and turn it over real quick. You don't hold my attention that long. On a A2, A4, or 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, you can get 4 on one, and then you can do both sides. Just some thoughts to add to that, what you were saying about tracks.
Yeah.
I feel like when you land in a country, that's like paramount. Next to having a contact information, having an address, because like we heard a few weeks ago, Habakkuk 2:2, write the vision and make it plain. The make it plain is speaking about the quality of the expression, and the write it speaks about the necessity of the expression. So if I'm propagating the gospel, there is a necessity for me to have something to communicate. I've gone to countries over the years that I remember, I don't even have a place to live yet, and I'm trying to make a track. I'm trying to have some way for folks to communicate with me and me to get the gospel to them, because if I'm meeting people, otherwise I'm just writing down numbers, and I've got to have a viable means of how do I reach this person. And many people have come to find us in Africa. They just had I found this piece of paper in a gutter. I found this piece of paper over here, like you said, and on that piece of paper was contact information. So maybe we could stress on that a little bit, Pastor Jason, about what kind of information, communicative-wise, besides the gospel, should be on my track.
Yeah, I think presentation is really important. Even the quality of the paper you print it on is really important.
Yes.
I mean, if people kind of feel like a really thin paper, they're going to immediately have that first impression that it's cheap.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think spend the extra money to make it a quality piece of paper and presentation. I think you should have information. I put my cell phone on tracks. Maybe that's not the best idea. An email maybe is a better idea. Something. Nowadays you have everyone and their grandmother calling you from every advertising agency because they're hunting numbers, but definitely have a contact info, maybe even a website. I know we do that in Frederick. We want people to, static communication. They're going to want to follow up to find out, okay, who are these people? Typically before they come to a meeting, they're going to look online to kind of find out the validity and credibility of someone. So absolutely have a website, but again, I think everyone has a story, Pastor Ronaldo, and
Yes.
I think people underestimate their experience and their testimony, and I think everyone should have something that they write about, not only about themselves, but what God has ministered to them or through them in their niche, finding their niche. So
Well, I know in missions, when the word literature comes up, the first thing a missionary thinks of is a track. That's the first word we think of. So it's good that you gave us some meat on the bone, so to speak, about how to do that, because there's no class on that. I remember I landed in a country and I literally just said, okay, I don't have anything to hand out. I gotta manufacture something quickly. You go into a copy center. You kind of take you take a photocopy of a graded race track. You change the little things on there, and then you put that together. So this is good. This is good stuff. I know a lot of folks are listening are thinking about this is good stuff. Sometimes it's that basic, it's that base. But on the other hand, let's expand the conversation, Pastor Steve. Let's get beyond tracks. I'm a missionary. I'm a pastor. Literally speaking, beyond tracks. I'm just going to throw some things out, and you guys can respond to it. Special events.
Yeah.
Special events. I find, like, I know in the first world, in Europe and America, tremendous amount of paper goes out for special events, like we're doing Christmas.
Yeah.
But think third world, special events.
Well, I think, okay, so, all right, so I spent, my career path was journalism, so I spent more than 25 years doing that, and part of my career was spent in, like, designing pages, which is kind of interesting. So here's some things that when I pick up something, like the image that you put on something,
Yes.
it should be something clear, and you shouldn't use a bunch of images. You should use a dominant image. That was something we were taught when I was designing, like, a front page for the sports section of the Baltimore Sun, which I did for several years. And then it might be interesting. You might, as far as, like, fonts go, it's better to use one font in various ways than several fonts.
Okay.
It's something about the human brain. This is what I learned from the people who taught me publication design. So if you use a single font in a variety of ways, a reader has a subtle mind. The mind subtly communicates that this is serious, that you planned what you're doing. So you could use the font in bold and different ways or italic, but you don't. If you mix and match fonts in the same kind of document, it can be counterproductive.
Okay.
And then the third thing is, like, whenever the short word will do, you should use the short word, not the long word. So, like, when you're trying to communicate, like, an event, like, what is it? It's a gospel music concert. It would bet, if you change that to something like extravaganza or use a bigger word, it seems that if you're like, what is it? Can you communicate a basic element? So I think a good image and a good font used well is going to serve getting your message across.
Yeah.
Now some
good.
people, when I tell them that, I don't like say this is what I was taught when I was working in a major metropolitan newspaper. This is the way we designed our pages. It's like, so you can choose to ignore that. I think I should use, like, 5 different fonts, and it will be more interesting to people. But the human brain really likes order.
Sure.
It's like, and when God wanted to bring order out of chaos and ruin, he spoke something, and he was very clear. And it seems like when Jesus started the Sermon on the Mount, he started all those statements, the Beatitudes, the same way. Blessed are the da-da-da. Blessed are the da-da-da. Blessed are the, and we remember those things. When the writer of Psalm 119 organized all of those 22 8-line collections of things that exalt the word, he used, this is the Hebrew letter. Here's 8 sentences about that Hebrew letter, worked his way through it. So there's I'm saying that when you use an order, when you use one font, so that's just you can take or leave that for what you
beautiful.
want. It's
That's
but I
great.
think that's like when you're communicating something, if you're communicating a poster and you want to put it up on the wall, if you have a great image with the words, what it is, where it is, when it is. So those are the 5 W's and the H of journalism: who, what, when, where, and why, and how. Why is like another question that you might not want to answer on a poster, but what is it, where is it, what time it is, and who's doing it? Those are very important questions to answer and put
Yes.
into any kind of, especially event communication, because you want people to show up.
Yeah.
This
Special
is where my
events,
Bible study is.
like if you have a conference, for instance, if you have a special season or a series or a special tent meeting you're doing in missions, more than announcements at church and missions, you're going to want to have something you can put in the hands of people that may be a fish hook to draw them in. It could be a special baptism. You could use events. Pastor Jason, let me bring you into this for a second. With tracts and special events, what are your thoughts about doing it yourself and hiring someone?
That's a great point. I mean, if you have the gift to do it yourself, but it's always good to have somebody around you, get a second or third opinion for sure, especially if someone does it for a living, then you certainly want to draw from them. I like what Pastor Steve was saying. It's got to be something that is clear, in order, because if someone, I guess in our Western society, people are looking at paper very quickly, even just tracts in general. I've gone to even a business card size, and
that's interesting.
That's good.
Let's park right there for a second. So you're saying beyond the I would say 4x6, which would be the A2, or even less than that, smaller than A2. You're saying even a business card. My question would, and I'm pushing back to you because when our listeners hear that, they're asking the question, can I get the gospel on a business card?
No, not really. What we've found in Delaware in particularly, people would receive our tracts, they take one look at them, and then they put them in their pocket. So we created a business card size that just had a catchy phrase like fully known and fully loved, and then it had a website. And we had much more people go to the website. Again, it's a generational thing. If it's a young person, that's typically what they're going to do. But if you're going to, the benefit of having a larger track is if someone even stuffs something in their pocket, maybe later on as they're changing for the day, they may go back and actually read that track.
Yes.
So I guess it's a generational thing. But with the young person, I mean, unfortunately, there's not a lot of people reading today. Yeah. That's just the matter of the fact. So, so I guess it depends on where you are. But if you're in a place where people are reading, then a good presentation, a clear presentation. And because, again, with any event, you want something that's going to help them with repetition and know what's their questions are going to be answered, like Pastor Steve just said.
Yeah, because it's like, I guess it's really regional. It's really regional. It's really national. In the sense of, okay, well, maybe like you said, maybe I have a multi-layered approach, and that's another conversation in itself in literature. In the propagation of the gospel in our ministry through literature, do we have a multi-layered approach? Do we have tracts, and do we also carry the business card, and do we also do special event promotions? Because here's what the average missionary is asking you: what kind of budget am I working with for missions? I mean, how much money can I commit to tracts and flyers and business cards? And I mean, and maybe you might reach a lot of people if you have a big budget, but if I've got a missionary budget, or I'm a fledgling church and we're just starting out, I don't have $5,000 a year or $3,000 a year to promote to that. And on this side of the water, even on that side of the water, it can be expensive because you're talking about, you're not using white paper, you're using colored paper. Colored paper is about 40% more expensive than white paper. You're talking about then you're getting it printed, and in many countries, cutting is not free. You have to pay someone to cut it or use a cutter. You also got to typeset it. That requires some kind of computer orientation of some kind, or typeset. Or if you're doing a poster, you're going to put some things to that. There's going to be money to this. So for many of us, when we think about literature, sometimes it's just a track. So maybe for a special event, I make a special track because it's still cheaper to make than, say, a poster. Because posters can get expensive. Yeah. We had a guy in one of our countries we went to. We had a guy who hand painted the poster for a conference. They had Pastor Belly on there and me, and he looked like Joe Paterno. Anyway, not even joking. So he painted this picture of all of us. He actually painted the poster. At the post, it saved us 80% because he painted it over making it. So I guess my point is like with special events, I think we should maybe with tracks. Maybe I can make my own tracks, but one thing about making your own tracks, it looks like it.
Sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, in Africa, the best track I've seen designed is self-designed with the South African church. The church in Pretoria, Pastor Gerald's church, They make an amazing track. A lot of the guys in their church have college degrees in marketing and literature, so they have skills. But most of the tracks you see pretty much let God love you on the front, the gospel message on the front, on the back, contact information, and that's pretty much the track. So the budget is low. But when you start thinking about larger events, then you have to ask yourself a question, and maybe a first world or second world church doesn't ask this question: do we want to put this in the budget? Because I think
Can I say something to that?
yes, sir.
Yeah, I think with the marketing rule is you get 1% return on all your paper invitations. If you like for brochures or something, that's one thing we saw. 1% was the highest part of your return. Well, I shouldn't say highest, but the normal return. But I think with like events, the more personal invitation that you can make it, you'll have a higher yield. Like if
Okay.
you're like a personal invitation, like for instance, with our Grow Deeper that we do on Tuesday nights, we have these little flyers and we hand them to people out at the door as people leave the church. And we're personally inviting them. We're personally engaging them. We're personally saying, we want you there. And I think nothing, takes the place of that type of invitation. So if you're going to make a track, is it personal? Is it an invitation? Or is it corporate looking? Or is it just sterile? You don't want that. I love your thoughts. Color, clarity, warm. We want you there. We want to communicate like we want you there. Otherwise, it's like a track attack. You're we were just in Frederick, 20 people out doing this thing for the homeless, and you're passing out thousands of tracks. It's like you'll get some people, but I think if you have a limited budget, just I think your personal exchange as you hand out and have the conversation is going to be much more, is going to be invaluable, really.
All right, let's switch tiers here for a second. Let's talk about church information. At some point, there's two ways to do church information. There's announcements, but in many churches, literature is best because no one listens to announcements. They're either too early in the program. I'm sorry, Pastor Steve.
I mean, it's the truth. It's not something that it's not lost on me.
They come in, most guys come into church late and miss it. Yeah. Or when the announcements are being said, they sounds like Charlie Brown's parents, waka, 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 you're tuning out, you're kind of like, you're just gone. So even in school at the parochial level, students didn't lean in and said, oh, it's announcements. They didn't kind of lean in. It's like, so they can't tell me that. So no matter how colorful you make them. So oftentimes we use written literature. I'll give you verbal highlights, but this is what we're doing right here. We put this in the hands of people. But in the first world, they're kind of digitizing that a bit.
A little bit.
But I still find that there is a place, particularly in missions, for the old school bulletin. Yeah. Because a lot of things, you got a bulletin, you hear this expression all the time in communications. Don't forget, in your bulletin, there's where we're going to be at this Sunday. Or in your bulletin, don't forget there's a baptism next week. Or in your bulletin. Or many times, folks have come and visited a church because they got a bulletin from someone else.
Well, you can do this. I've seen this went to a church just at the beginning of COVID, visited a church in New York, Lower Manhattan, one of the big, a church that, the pastors had a big literature input. But I noticed that the church, the bulletin, and teaching the people to be note takers. Like you could do a combo kind of thing. Everyone gets a bulletin. I was interested because the church was like it's an old Salvation Army place, and it was like sort of like a bowl, and you came down to the stage. But the person with the bulletin is near the stage. Now he's holding the bulletin near the front of the stage. So it actually subtly drew people closer to the pulpit.
Well done.
And then it had a good image on the front. It said the theme for the Sunday. Now, some pastors are a different kind of preaching. They don't plan that kind of thing. But and then there was the bulletin. There was the bulletin part, coming things. And then there was a space for the scripture. It had the list of the scriptures that the pastor was going to use in the message. And then it had a place for notes. And so it served two purposes. It gave everyone in their hand the events that were coming, and a list of like important contact numbers. Like for now, this church had like it had an addictions ministry, it had a food pantry, it had a lot of things that we have in our church here in Baltimore, and it listed all those things in. It was just the same thing, 8.5 by 11, folded like this. You opened this up, it had the name and all the contact information. Then you had your bulletin, and then these 2 pages were left for the message.
Beautiful.
And that, to me, encouraged people to take notes. So this would fit nicely in a good Bible, and there you have it. So that's one way of it depends on if you're just church planting, I'm thinking. Well, if you want, if you can do that as a pastor, if you can do that, maybe I know Pastor Shabelli talks about preaching through or through 1 Corinthians 13 for several weeks when he plants a church. It's if you know that you're going to do that, it seems like you could encourage note-taking and get people to connect with their Bible and give the announcement. But you're right. It's I do think it still seems to be that paper announcements, if it says what something is, when it is, where it is, and if you have a who that's attached to it, if there's a name attached to it, if you answer those 4 questions and you put it there in a succinct manner, then you're doing a great service to the people who are coming to your Bible study or to your church service, because they have it right there.
Look at the refrigerators you see around. Refrigerators are full of paper.
Exactly.
So people are saving paper. They are. I've gone and visited people's houses and seen our tracks in people's mirrors and people's rooms. They've saved a piece of paper. So again, literature is still a major relevant source of communication. If I am a propagator of the gospel, I cannot ignore that. And maybe I have to rethink how much time and money and skill and quality, as you mentioned, Pastor Jason, that I put towards that, because the reality of it is, the church will not grow by oral tradition. The church didn't grow by oral tradition alone. There was as we heard earlier, there was literature involved. So I can't miss that piece. But the thing that's crossing my mind, Pastor Jason, I want to put that up. I push this back to you again. Maybe this is not my thing, or maybe this is not my gift. Maybe I got to pray about committing money to this and hiring someone, if they're not inside the church, hiring someone to do that. I know there was a certain season in Zambia, we stopped making our own tracks after year 2. And for the next 7.5 years, I paid a printer to make our tracks. Mm-hmm. I remember in Zimbabwe after year 3. I remember in South Africa after year 1, we wanted a quality track, but also too it became cumbersome for us to do it, and we also couldn't grow the vision, because if you do a track, for instance, it's got a logo or it's got an emblem, you want to put that on everything you do, you can't be that professional on your own. Is it really valid to hire someone?
Absolutely. I think, if that's not a strong point, it's not a waste of money to put money towards it. Again, it's a fish hook. I want to go back to what Pastor Steve was saying too, that the nature of our society here in the West, is it anywhere really, is people are moving so fast, and there's so much information coming at people, and forgetfulness is really an issue. So a paper trail, as we could say, a paper announcement or bulletin. I love our bulletins. We do a 3 months at a glance at what we do seasonally now here at Greater Grace, and very, very helpful. It very much helps to the attendance of an event, but I think people are just too busy and unable to remember everything. So that repetition, that reminder is key. So yes, I mean, money wise, it's not wasted money to have a good someone that does that maybe for a living or has their niche in that. I think people like in our church, Anu does excellent work with our video announcements, which have been, for instance, the homeless outreach on Thursday, there had to be 60 plus people. And most people I spoke with, they said it was the video that really touched their heart. So not to get off topic, but just to say that, paper is critical to helping people remember, hey, this is important to me. This is something that's that repetition. I think of these words, it helps people. It's repetition, helps people meditate. It kind of penetrates through the mind so they remember it, and then reiterate. They're able to speak it out to other people and say, hey, there's credibility here. There's validity here. This ministry, I've heard about this ministry. There's branding. That's a whole nother topic, like
Yes.
logo, format. Branding is super valuable. And we hear it on advertising, the jingle, people remember the jingle. But again, I'm getting off topic, but branding is really key, I think, with written material as well.
Also, too, I think we're talking about literature. I think at some point we may find ourselves having some kind of literature that we're using for our Sunday school or Christian education. I think as you're starting a church, oftentimes, even in the third world, you do get a lot of children. You get a lot of children early and often. You do. I remember several churches, I had more kids than I had adults for a long time. And so you can do oral tradition, but when you've got something tangible that you can put in a child's hand, whatever it is on any level, it tends to communicate things and propagate doctrine a lot more. I'm going to say it sticks more. Let's say it that way. Let me ask you this question. Let me change gears again here and ask you this question, Pastor Jason, and I'll come back to you, Pastor Steve. What do you think is the most important literature in a church besides the Bible?
Oh, the most important literature?
The most important piece of literature in a church besides the Bible. Because when I'm planning a church and I have limited resources and I have limited gifts, but I want to have the most impact besides giving out Bibles and the Bible itself, what other piece and the answer might be obvious to you, and the answer might be we may have already said it, but in your experience as a missionary, what was the most important piece of literature paper literature that you used on the mission field beyond the Bible?
Wow, I would say just that an invitation to the church, how to come to the church, maybe an invitation to maybe study materials or a counseling theme. I would say,
like a track?
yeah, I would say, I guess outside the Bible would be an invitation to come to the church, because it would be a way for them to come learn more than just exactly what's being written on the paper. Because I guess paper can be limited. Like for instance, with paper, you want to address not only the person but the person's family too. I like to think about, okay, this person might be a single person, college person. That's awesome, but what if they're a family man? Maybe they're a mother of 5, or like, am I addressing the whole family? Is there a little bit nuances, like you said, about children? Because again, with when families come to church, maybe the first impression didn't really touch the parents, but it really impacted the kids. So on the way home, the kids are like, "Hey, Mom, look at this coloring I just did, and this is what I learned in Sunday school." And then, because the kid had such a good time, the parent says, "Okay, we'll come back," and then maybe they're impacted the second or third time. So I would just say, maybe it's a big answer, but I would just say have something that addresses the whole family, and then secondly, the invitation to the church would probably be the next most important outside the Bible itself.
Yeah, I think that's probably the truth. I would, if you're thinking about that, I would say first would say a bulletin, but I would think maybe an invitation. That also has to be a part of, like, the kind of thing that you would give to a person, saying this is what our church is about. And I think you're right, Pastor Jason. It needs to address like all those points as succinctly and simply as possible, like hitting all the points. And so that's a challenge. But I think the consistency of it, something that represents you well, that comes to the point of, do you pay somebody to design something really attractive, as opposed to something that you just sort of cowboy through a website that sort of just, that
Stop
kind
cowboying, Pastor Jason.
So, I'm just saying, if you're like at the beginning, you're just doing something like that. But I would say like an invitation. I was thinking, like, if you're going to door in your neighborhood, or like now we're going to go caroling, we're going to be out, we're going to see people. We want to put something in their hands that says, this is our church. This is where we are. this is what we have, and this is when we meet. And all those elements should be addressed. And like you said, like people don't really like to open up saying, can you
Yes.
do that in 6 sentences? I think you can. It just takes work. But like you need to say, like you need to advertise, program for kids K through 12 or K through 6, those kind of things, Spanish interpretation at all services. All those things are like contact points. And it is like, you should really spend, that should be maybe beyond the bulletin, because you can make announcements to say what's happening, or you can have a bulletin board that has a poster of your special events. But when you're going out and you see somebody on mass transportation, as like many of the cities, people are riding on buses and crowding into buses, if you can just give them, this is my church, you could come. And, just getting all those points, I think that's the right kind of investment.
Sounds like okay, I've got my track, and that is my invitation to the kingdom.
Yes.
So the focus on the track is the invitation to the kingdom, but it sounds like what you're describing is more of an invitation to welcome card, which is an invitation to the church. Now that's an interesting thought in the sense that missionaries don't think about that. We kind of make that secondary. We have the invitation to the kingdom, which is why 60% of the track is the gospel. Mm-hmm. Then light communication on the back that doesn't address family, that barely gives you just an address and meeting times. That's about all you're going to get on the back of a track, right? Yeah. So if it's almost like I've got a very small space and I've got to decide my emphasis. And if for most of us in the missions, the emphasis is the gospel, which I think is correct. But I also like the idea, and this is something that many missionaries are not considering, is the welcome, an invitation card. Third world is not thinking about that, because in our mind, the track is the welcome card, the invitation, because that's how minor. But you're talking about where the promotion is about, we want you to come to us. We're not preaching the gospel. The gospel may even be on there, but in the limited amount of space we got, we want to tell you that you're welcome, and all of you and who you are and where you are and how you are is welcome, and we're welcoming you. We're inviting you. And oftentimes, I can tell you now in my experience, on the field, I haven't seen many of those from churches, missionary churches, or just churches in general. The larger churches, the more established churches, you kind of get the welcome card when you come. You don't get that on the street. So that's more of an in-reach. The track got you in the door maybe. The welcome card kind of makes you feel comfortable that you're here and this is what we have to offer. But what really works for a welcome card in a lot of missionary churches is the bulletin. Yeah. In other words, they wouldn't have a welcome card or invitation card. They'd have a track, then a bulletin. The bulletin's what you get when you come in. The track is what you get when you're outside. But this third thing, you both are bringing this welcome, this invitation card. Well, maybe this person, I'm not giving them the gospel. Maybe I'm giving them an invitation to come to church, because some guys may be put off by that. They might toss it. But an invitation where you say something in the invitation card that piques interest that maybe they didn't get in the gospel. It could be a fishhook. I just know for many missionaries, the track is definitely a necessity. The bulletin is optional, but an invitation welcome card, particularly in the third world, which is 2/3 of the world, 75% of the world's not looking for an invitation card or welcome card. They're not getting that. That's strictly, mostly North America and Europe, mostly. You're not going to see that too much. You're not going to see that too much in Asia or India or Africa or South America. Here's a welcome card. You're going to get a track, and inside the church, you might get where you sign up and you say, "Hey, welcome to our church. Here's a visitor's card," and part of your visitor's packet may have something that's welcoming. But I like the idea, because if you arm your people on the team first with welcome cards, they may meet someone who is already saved, so they read a track, "I'm already saved," and throw it away, which often happens. "I'm already born again," throw it. But a welcome card says, yes, you are saved, but you're welcome.
I think the thing that we're getting to is like there's, with literature, it's probably a multitude of counselors is best approach. Like you do, I would say like an invitation, like Christmas, we have an invitation that's ready right now at church for
Yeah.
people to come to the thing. So that's a good thing. But you're talking about a bulletin for people who come through the door. And then as things get better, we have statements of faith and we have booklet ministry, we certain things that are reduced to like bite-size things. All of that is purposeful
Yes.
in terms of how we get people to become disciples.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Pastor Jason, any last thoughts about this literature thought? It's actually a bigger thought than you at first blush. You don't get the thought, but it's a bigger thought. And I honestly believe that in missions, we don't think deeply about it. Many of us make homemade tracts and go out there and just hand out tracts, push the gospel, and then, like you said, it unwittingly it turns into tract attack because it becomes the number one means of literature communication in your church.
I don't know. I would say engage the reader. Like sometimes, maybe you're doing a theme at your church and have a question: is God real? Is heaven real? Is hell real? Like have provoking questions maybe on your literature to, because some people are not gonna. They're gonna think church. Okay, no. God, no, but maybe you can provoke them to think on something that's going to hit them where they live. I think that's a big thing. Pastor Schaller says a lot, like hit them where they live. So again, reaching the unsaved, I think we have to kind of go on the edge a little bit and really hit them where they live. As far as the person in the church, maybe we could say an invitation says a message for the whole family, an experience for the whole family. I don't know if you want to use that word experience because that can be going a lot of ways, but love that touches the whole family. Like, again, I'd say address the whole family because there's a better likelihood of people actually staying in your church if it addresses the whole family. That's what we try to do with InReach. Are we hitting the whole family?
Sure.
Usually there's one person out of the family that's really responding. The other few are just kind of like not really getting it. So a multi-layered approach is very valuable. And I'll just say again, like whatever you do, whatever you, I think of Pastor Stevens, a track was instrumental in his salvation. And you can't underestimate the written word. It's incredibly valuable because it'll go beyond where you go. It'll outlast you and it'll reach people you'll never meet. So
yes, beautiful. I like the idea that you gave about trying to reach as much of a person's personal world as you can. And I like the idea of what Pastor Steve said, piggybacking what you said, to thematically do a series like this. And this sounds a little bit front of the room. It sounds a little hotsy-totsy here where you say, okay, I'm going to do a series. Why not commit the money and the time and promote the series? Why not? Most of us on the mission field are not going to promote through literature a series that we're doing on say hell, whatever. But I like the idea because you may draw folks that, okay, I already got this. This is a classic one right here. I already got this track. I already got this. You guys come here every Tuesday from 10 to 12. I already got this. But when you give them something different that's relevant, that, as you said, hit them where they live, and it says, okay, what is man? Who is God? Where are we? Just different things. And you have a series on it, like who am I with God? Have a series. Folks that normally wouldn't come to your church may come to your church. It could be something you give out with a track. It could be something for a small season. It could be seasonal. And the only thing we really do seasonally, to be honest with you, on the mission field, most of the time, is we don't promote messages. We promote seasons. We promote events. Okay, it's the Christmas season, or okay, there's going to be a special visitor here from so-and-so, or there's a conference. We promote events. But it's very rare on the mission field that there's a promotion or there's propagation of a specific series. We don't promote the pulpit, which is another whole conversation in of itself. But it's been great talking to you two about literature in the mission field. We've talked about some things that ordinarily wouldn't get discussed in a missions meeting. There's not a deep conversation about tracts. There isn't a deep conversation about literature. It's one of the there's deeper conversations about the price of meat and the closest market than there is about literature. So it's great to discuss these things, and I've grown a little bit here today, just thinking in terms of how to promote not just the kingdom of God, but the people of God and the assembly of God. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time here on Missions Monday.